I'm Betsey Dexter Dyer. I am a member of the Walpole Historical Society. I do quite a bit of research there, and this particular topic that I'm going to tell you about is about harvesting pond ice in Walpole, Massachusetts. It was a topic suggested to me a couple of years ago by Roger Turner Jr., who died last year, although he got to see the products of this research, thank goodness. And I started off not knowing much of anything about harvesting ice in Walpole, but Roger really guided me through this topic. Some of you may know that his family was one of the major harvesters of ice in Walpole on Turner's Pond. So the first thing you can see from the title of this presentation is that it's really just 4 ponds in Walpole out of more than a dozen ponds that we have in Walpole. Morey's Pond, Diamond Pond, Smith's Pond, and Clark's Pond were our major venues for ice harvesting, for commercial ice harvesting. And Morey's Pond is currently called Turner's Pond. I'm going to call it Morey's Pond through most of this presentation because that was the original name and that was its name through most of its history of ice harvesting. Notice also that the time period during which ice was harvested in Walpole, 1880 to 1940, is fairly brief compared to some other New England towns where serious commercial ice harvesting began in the 1830s and 1840s and 1850s. So I'll try to explain also why we were relatively late in the game with ice harvesting and why it was only 4 ponds. I'm also going to tell you a little bit about Ellis Pond, which, yes, is in Norwood, and also about Plimpton's Farm Pond. That was a relatively minor operation, but it might be of interest to some people viewing this. So where did I get the name for this presentation of Wonderful Purity? It came from an 1888 edition of the Walpole Star. That was Walpole's newspaper for many years in the 19th century. And it was about Diamond Pond, which was declared to be of wonderful purity. It is possibly the origin of the name Diamond Pond. It's true that Diamond Pond looks somewhat diamond-shaped on old maps of the pond, but it also may have been an especially pure, diamond-pure water of the pond that gave it its name. So briefly, I want to start with how ice harvesting is done. I'm not going to dwell on this for very long because there are lots of other sources for this. It wasn't anything unique to Walpole, but just to set the scene, how we went about harvesting ice on ponds. This is from a photograph from Roger Turner Jr. It's probably from Milton, Mass, where his family started with ice harvesting. You can see there's an ice house in the background with a ramp and some ice being brought up. The ice house is right next to the pond, and there are some men with a saw and some other devices that I'll talk about in the next slide. So first of all, and this again, this is from the Woods Hole Museum, not from Walpole. Woods Hole Museum has a wonderful exhibit on this. First step is that you're essentially plowing a groove in the ice in both directions. You can see that the people here have already plowed in one direction going toward the horse, and now they're plowing in the other direction, but they're not cutting all the way through the ice because otherwise that would be an unstable surface for that horse to be standing on. They're just making a groove, and they are using a plow-like device, and they're using a horse as though it were a plow horse. And the horse had to have special horseshoes, and the people on the ice often had special cleats attached to their shoes so that they could be stable on the ice. And the saws that they used next were enormous things. It's hard to even see this in the photograph, but if you'd like to come by the Walpole Historical Society, we actually have a couple of these big ice saws in the basement that people can show to you if you take a visit. Because the next step was to use these saws to cut through the grooves that had been made by that plow-like device. And the next step was to split blocks of ice away from each other so they could be floated along in a channel. And here I am using another thing that we've got at the Historical Society, an ice splitting fork. And by the way, that was pretty heavy. I was holding it up with both hands. So all of the equipment that was used for ice harvesting was heavy iron equipment for breaking up and sawing huge blocks of ice. And then the ice would be guided along canals toward the ice house using various sorts of picks like this, various shapes. And you can look up more about ice harvesting and get a lot more detail, but I want to get into Walpole's unique history of ice harvesting. First of all, we have mill ponds in Walpole. We do not have big glacial ponds as they do in other places in New England. This map, which does not include South Walpole, but on which you can see the Neponset River, look down toward the bottom of this map and see the word Neponset River written sideways. See how the Neponset River is snaking up through Walpole and then gets dammed up, first at one pond, then at another, goes a little bit further, it gets dammed up again, goes a little further, it gets dammed up again, and again, all the way to East Walpole. There are several ponds in a row along the Neponset, and they tend to be elongated mill ponds. And that has a couple of consequences. One consequence is that an elongated pond tends to have a river-like flow, and that river-like flow means they don't necessarily freeze up reliably. Think of Bird Pond in East Walpole, for example, actually has a river-like flow and probably is not ever safe to cross on ice. The other thing is Walpole had a lot of heavy industries, and so one after another, these ponds polluted each other, and there was no market for ice with any noticeable impurities in it. So the main ponds for Walpole ice harvesting were the ones that were on tributaries to the Neponset River. See Morey's Pond up in the left-hand corner? That's present-day Turner's Pond, and Morey's Pond is on a tributary to the Neponset, and its water was pure because there was no industry upstream of it. And then look over to the right, you see Clark's Pond and you see Diamond Pond. And those two were on tributaries. Spring Brook is the tributary. Those two were used for ice harvesting. And then down in South Walpole, on a map that I'll show you later, is Smith's Pond, and that was used for ice harvesting. But the other mill ponds were either too polluted or had too much of a river-like flow. This confirms, I think, what I was saying about our lack of glacial ponds, which were really the most popular ponds for commercial ice harvesting. You can see there are blue dots all over the map of Massachusetts. Those are the locations of all the major glacial ponds. And you know where Walpole is, just about south of Boston, and you can see a sort of an empty place where Walpole is. We really don't have any major glacial ponds. We might have a little pond here and there in the Walpole woods, but nothing that you could cut ice on. So we were not major contenders. I would say we did it our way. Walpole, Massachusetts did it our way when it comes to ice harvesting. So I'm going to start with Morey's Pond. Now remember, that's Turner's Pond nowadays, if you want to visualize that. And it wasn't the very first pond on which ice was harvested in Walpole, but it was one of the first. The first ice harvest that I could determine for Morey's Pond was 1881. And I want to show you this old map of Morey's Pond and orient you a little bit. Can you see down in the lower left-hand corner of this pond the word Elm Street? That's Elm Street going right past where the skating house or skating cabin is right now. If you stood at that skating cabin just off of Elm Street and looked across, you would see, and now look across in your mind's eye, Gill's Dam. The original pond was Gill's Pond behind Gill's Dam, not shown on this map, and then a new dam was built, And if you go around to the right-hand side there, you can see a causeway going across the right-hand part of the pond. That's the new dam that dammed up Morey's Pond in the 1850s. And right on that causeway was the enterprise of one of the Lewises. This was E. Frank Lewis. And to the left there, you can see huge ice houses. And to the right, you can see his wool scouring mill operation. And if you're trying to visualize where this is today, that road going in front of the ice houses and in front of the wool scouring mill is present-day Mill Pond Road, right off of Elm Street. You can actually drive along that road and maybe visualize the big mill that used to be there and the big ice houses. And here, to give a little more orientation, a modern day Google Earth map, you can see Mill Pond Road just to the right there, which now goes into another road, Elm Crest Circle. And I have labeled ice house and mill site. See how I've labeled it on the right-hand side? So that's where the original ice house was, and that's where the original mill site. I've also labeled across the pond on the far left side Lakeview and also Elm Crest. That's the Turner family homestead. And also look at the top of the map, and you can see little tiny Gill's Pond. Remember I said Gill's Pond was the original pond in this area until Turner's Pond or Morey's Pond was dammed up. And I also wrote in Elm Street along the bottom there to orient you. So I found a wonderful article in the Walpole Star from 1883 that I think gives us a real flavor of what it was like to see an ice harvest on Morey's Pond. First of all, 60 men were employed there, and I can tell you right now those 60 men were not all from Walpole. Gangs of ice harvesters would go town to town as needed and be paid to harvest ice because it was a very time-sensitive operation. You had to harvest when the ice was thick enough, and there was always a danger of a thaw or a snowstorm to change that. Notice they worked round the clock, another indication of how time sensitive this was. They were aided by moonlight. And notice that Mr. Lewis, that's E. Frank Lewis, who owned the big ice houses, look what he was providing them to eat. Hot chocolate, sandwiches, cheese, and then huge numbers, huge tonnages of ice were cut typically in a harvest. So 6,000 tons were cut in that particular harvest and put away. And then look, a crowd of people came to watch, including not a few ladies, in quotes, because it must have been quite a spectacle to see this huge gang of workers working round the clock to get that ice harvest in. But by 1885, Fred Hartshorn was now working with E. Frank Lewis. And I'm mentioning that here because people in Walpole knew each other, they worked with each other. Fred Hartshorn started at Diamond Pond. I now have him working with E. Frank Lewis in 1885. I want you to remember that when we get around to talking about Diamond Pond, because something happened at Diamond Pond that allowed Fred Hartshorn to be available to work with E. Frank Lewis. Meanwhile, though, let's talk about pollution. Between 1885 and 1890, there was a terrible lawsuit that occurred in which E. Frank Lewis was sued by the mill owners Bird, Vose, Stetson, and others. And you probably recognize the names Bird and Vose, Vose of Hollingsworth and Vose, which still has a mill in town. These were downstream of Lewis's enterprise, and these mill owners were suing Lewis because he was apparently pouring pollution into the Neponset River and having an effect on those downstream businesses. Notice how long the lawsuit went on. These people had deep pockets, and from 1885 to 1890, the newspapers were full of all the goings-on between these mill owners. So here we are back at E. Frank Lewis's mill. So that's a wool scouring mill to the right there. And here's what the newspaper described as going into the Neponset River. Great quantities of grease and sheep dung and other things like lumps of animal matter, because what E. Frank Lewis was doing at his mill was cleaning wool. It was a wool scouring mill. And you might be thinking, how dirty could wool possibly be? It sounds like a relatively benign operation. Apparently, huge quantities of wool that are being processed commercially, at least in those days, came in with a great quantity of other materials that were pouring into the river. And he was processing 9.5 tons of wool per day and using 57 pounds of soap per day. So the soap was also going into the river and affecting downstream industries. Here is a picture of a wool scouring machine. So wool was being passed from one vat to another, but then finally that dirty water had to drain out somewhere, and that somewhere was first Mill Brook, but then into the Neponset River. So here on this map, we can see Morey's Pond at the top of the map, and we can see it coming down on its own tributary. We can see it coming into the Neponset and heading to Stetson's Pond. You can see Stetson's Pond over to the right, and from there it goes on over to East Walpole, where it gets to Bird's Pond and Vaux Pond. Notice how Lewis Pond is not affected, because Lewis Pond is upstream. That's where the rest of E. Frank Lewis's family mill operations were taking place. So interestingly, E. Frank Lewis's pollution from Morey's Pond did not affect his own family members who were operating in and around Lewis Pond. It was only affecting people downstream. All right, so by 1890, Lewis had essentially been run out of town. The lawsuit was so acrimonious and so expensive that he ended up building his mills, rebuilding his mills in Lawrence, Massachusetts. And at that point, Horace Speer, who previously had been at Diamond Pond, suddenly became available to cut ice on Morey's Pond. I'll let you know the reason in just a bit. But before you feel too sorry for E. Frank Lewis, the next slide shows you his mill complex in Lawrence, Massachusetts. He did extremely well in Lawrence, Massachusetts, and maybe better than he would have had he stayed in Walpole. And in fact, if you go up to Lawrence, Massachusetts to their historical society and their museum, you'll find that they really have taken claim of E. Frank Lewis. They consider him to be a Lawrence, Massachusetts mill owner, not a major Walpole mill owner. So at that point, with Lewis gone out of town, it was Speer's operation, and here's his advertisement from the 1893 directory for Walpole businesses and residents. And here is an insurance map. A Sanborn map is an insurance map typical of that time from 1894, showing you the edge of Morey's Pond. You can see it down on the lower left-hand corner. You can see the mill operation to the right, and you can see these huge ice houses to the left. And at that point, they're called Speer's ice houses on the edge of Morey's Pond. And I will tell you the 1899 Sanborn map has a similar look. What's sticking out from the ice house is a ramp. So that's the ramp that the ice is transported from the pond up to the ice house with. 1895, Speer quietly added a partner, and that was Jacob Arthur Turner of Milton, Massachusetts. That, by the way, is Roger Turner Jr.'s grandfather. And he had a huge ice operation in Milton on Turner's Pond in Milton. The original Turner's Pond is in Milton, Mass., and it's still a pond there called Turner's Pond. And why did Speer quietly add the partner? Jacob Arthur Turner was a huge entrepreneur all over New England with ice and also with real estate, and I think he was quietly acquiring the business without alerting competitors. It was something that I discovered by doing research at the Registry of Deeds site, but it was not something obvious in the newspapers that Jacob Arthur Turner was in town and was about to acquire the future Turner's Pond. In 1896, the enterprise began to call itself the Walpole Ice Company, and it was being operated at that point by Turner and Speer, maybe emphasis on Turner. And ice houses burned down all the time. They were extremely flammable, so there was a setback in the business in 1900. It was apparently due to an arsonist or incendiary, happened overnight. And notice how the newspaper words it. It's the ice house belonging to Speer, and also, because they weren't exactly sure who this Turner was, a gentleman by the name of Turner, who was in fact Jacob Arthur Turner, who resides in Milton. So at this point, Turner's presence in town was not living here. There were no Turners living in town, but they were beginning to get a real foothold with ice harvesting. By 1900, Jacob Arthur Turner owned the entire business, all of the pond, all of the shoreline, and actually quite a bit of other real estate in Walpole as well. And he had done all of this fairly quietly. So again, I don't think people in town were necessarily aware that the entire thing had been bought by Jacob Arthur Turner. And here is his ice house. Remember, the original ice house had burned in 1900. And the big difference here on this 1911 Sanborn map is that his ice ramp goes off to the left. You can see it. So I think he's repositioned the ice house a little bit as well. And of course, it's labeled J.A. Turner at this point. And this is a postcard in which you're getting a little glimpse of what that ice house might have looked like circa 1900. There's a ramp that you can see. A lot of vegetation is obscuring our view of it. I'll show you some more striking pictures of ice houses for Clark's Pond a little bit later. Another view of Morey's Pond and ice houses across it. This one was showed to me by Roger Turner Jr., and he says those are the ice houses across the pond. It's again, not something that really resolves itself as looking like an ice house at that distance, but I think he may be right about it with Mill Pond Road coming down from the right. In 1930, Roger Turner, and this is Roger Turner Sr., Roger Turner Jr.'s father, married Louise Lambert and came to live at the house called Lakeview, which they renamed Elmcrest, and that some people in town might know that house as being the original Turner homestead up on a hill overlooking where the skating cabin is right now. And Roger Turner Jr. was born in 1932, their first son. And right around that time, the Milton Ice Company began to advertise artificial ice. And that became their major business starting in the 1930s, because pond ice was subject to shortages. There was a seasonality to it. You could run out of it. You could have a bad ice year, and making artificial ice, which the Milton Ice Company, that's the Turner's Ice Company, was able to do, became the way to produce ice. So probably it was 1936 that the last ice harvest occurred on Turner's Pond. And by the way, that was a first memory of 4-year-old Roger Turner Jr. He remembers being set on a block of ice by some of the workers and sent for a ride down the channel where the other ice blocks were going, while people probably monitored his progress along, as he was only 4 years old. And then shortly after that ice harvest, that final ice harvest, was a huge, huge ice house fire, one of the largest fires in Walpole's history, and that was the end of the ice houses there. Now, you might be feeling sorry for the Turner family. Don't feel sorry for the Turner family, just in case you were thinking poor Roger Turner Sr. had been sent there to operate the ice business for his family. Here is a long list that I'm not going to read aloud for you. I'll just give you the highlights. It turns out that Roger Turner Sr. was a famous figure skater, called one of the first great American figure skaters. He was in the Olympics 2 times. He was multiple winner of figure skating championships in the United States. He was inducted into the Figure Skating Hall of Fame in 1994, right after his death. And I'll tell you a little anecdote about his rivalry with Dick Button. He remains, to this day, tied with Dick Button, also a very famous Olympic ice skater, for the most consecutive U.S. championships. And Roger Turner Sr., according to his son, Roger Turner Jr., always said that Dick Button lobbied to have figures made less important to figure skating so that Dick Button would have an advantage because he was not so good at figures, and Roger Turner Sr. apparently was good at figures. In the old days, they used to actually literally make figures, like a figure 8 or letters or numbers or other shapes with the blades of their skate. That's where the word figure for figure skating came in. 1938, Roger Turner Sr. began to put on huge star-studded ice carnivals on Morey's Pond, which more and more was being called Turner's Pond because of the presence of the Turners there. And the next slide shows you actually his second ice carnival. Usually made the first page of the Walpole Times. Usually there were photographs of people doing all sorts of ice dancing. And what's absolutely amazing about these carnivals is they were being put on pond ice. Nowadays, when you think of an ice carnival or an ice show, it's on artificial ice indoors where they can control conditions. So it's really an extraordinary thing that year after year after year, Roger Turner Sr. would put on these huge carnivals. And the Milton Company, formerly the Milton Ice Company, you can see on that little advertisement from the 1940s, more and more focused on fuels for home fuels, industry fuels, less and less on ice, and what ice they did make was artificial ice, which they produced at an ice plant up in Mattapan. So more and more, there were no more commercial pond ice harvesting companies, certainly by the 1940s. So now Diamond Pond, 1880 to 1892. Something interesting there. Why such a short history of ice harvesting? I'm going to explain that to you. This is the first mention that I could find of ice harvesting on a Walpole pond. So I believe this is the first ice harvest in Walpole, 1880. But then only 12 years worth of ice harvesting. Why? First of all, here's Diamond Pond. Can you see the word Diamond Mill in the middle of that map? And can you see kind of a big rectangular shaped pond? Maybe you could construe that as a diamond shape. That's Diamond Pond, just to the east of Walpole Center in that map. And by the way, what's a little bit upstream of Diamond Pond is Clark's Pond, and I know it doesn't look like Clark's Pond that we know today, but I will talk about Clark's Pond later and tell you how that shape came to be. Here's another picture of Diamond Pond, and you can see there are two channels coming out of it on the left-hand side, and in small letters it says ice house. There's an ice house right there in that little island-like area between the two channels. So this was convenient to the pond, and this was a major ice harvesting venue. This was Hartshorn, and then Guild, and then Speer's industry, one after another, 1880, 1885, 1887, and there was a connection there with dairies. Julius Guild had an ice delivery service. He also had a dairy. He owned the business briefly. You can see him there in 1885. And so one of the themes that I came across for Walpole ice harvesting was that many of the local people that were involved with it were getting ice to use to preserve milk for their dairies or for other people's dairies. Some of the smaller enterprises were about that. And here is, down at the bottom of that page of advertising, is an advertisement for Hartshorn's business. He calls himself a dealer in ice, and that's his business on Diamond Pond. And there's Julius Guild's ad. He calls it Diamond Pond Ice. And here's Diamond Pond again. And you can see the ice house labeled there, just to the top where the two channels come out of the pond. And you can see Old Diamond Street curving in. And to this day, you can actually drive up Old Diamond Street and be right at the edge there where the ice house used to be. So here's an interesting thing that happened, and this is what probably stopped ice harvesting on Diamond Pond. A new rail line opened up in 1892. This was the new East Walpole Branch Railroad that was going to finally go to the Bird Mill complex and to Hollingsworth and Vose. They'd been waiting for it for years. This was a huge triumph to get this new rail line opened up. And here I need to orient you to show you how that rail line affected Diamond Pond. I know you can see Diamond Pond right up there at the top. And what I want you to see, though, is South Street. Take a minute to see South Street. It comes up from the bottom of the picture, left-hand side. It's labeled South Street. And see how the rail line comes up more or less parallel with South Street. We know it does. You can go behind the Council on Aging today, and you can see the old rail trail that's being used as a walking trail now. We know it goes along more or less parallel to South Street. And now see that rail line curve ever so slightly over to Diamond Pond and then cross Diamond Pond, which it does today, to get over to East Walpole. And another picture, a little more dramatic. You can see the railroad is shown with that traditional railroad line with the little cross hatches across it. It's showing a really sharp bend as that line takes a detour across Diamond Pond. See Diamond Pond up in the, on the right-hand side? See the railroad going straight across it? And there's Old Diamond Street. So what happened is that when the first big steam engine, coal-burning steam engine went through, it threw off soot and clouds of smoke and shards of coal and all sorts of things, and apparently spoiled the pond ice. At least that's the story. So that ever after, because of the pond ice, in order to sell pond ice, it needed to be pristine. Forever after, that was no longer an ice cutting venue after that rail line went through. Next slide shows you a steam train that I just got from online, showing you how if one of these trains is going up a grade or carrying a heavy load, it can really throw off a lot of debris and particulate matter. And so the story was that this was the cause of the pond ice no longer being a viable enterprise at Diamond Pond. And suddenly, remember I said suddenly, Horace Speer was available to cut ice at Morey's Pond. So how do we know all this? And I was concerned about it because I couldn't find anything in the newspapers about Diamond Pond suddenly being a non-viable location for ice. So I really looked into it, and the next slide shows you a sort of chain of communication, starting with Horace Aaron Speer, who died in 1914. He's the one that had the ice business on Diamond Pond, and he's the one that had the ice business spoiled. You can see that his son, Horace Albertus Speer, overlapped with him and probably heard the story from his father. He's the one that founded a hardware store in town. He in turn had a son, Evans F. Speer, who definitely overlapped with his father and even overlapped with his grandfather a little bit. So if this was a story that got passed down, then Evans F. Speer would have heard it, who in turn had a son, Robert Speer, who only died recently in 2015. So I'm thinking that although the story never appeared in the newspaper, it was a Speer family story and that it got passed down fairly reliably in town. And their story was that the railroad wanted to cross Diamond Pond, and they said, sure, cross Diamond Pond. We'd love to have a railroad go across because we'll be able to haul ice out of there more efficiently and ship it up to Boston, not realizing what the consequences would be. Other people say it was the Speers that were lobbying to get the railroad to cross, and they encouraged the railroad because, again, they were hoping to have a way of getting their ice conveniently up to Boston. However it was, I think it's a fairly reliable story once I analyze this. And here's what you see today when you go to Old Diamond Street. You only see a little tiny piece of Diamond Pond because there's the railroad bridge going across, and there's an old rail line that goes through there. If you look at it, you can find it. And you don't really see the rest of Diamond Pond, which is mostly privately owned today. Here it is. So you can see the old railway, no longer active, cutting a tip off of Diamond Pond. Again, on Old Diamond Street, you're only seeing that tip, and the rest of Diamond Pond is mostly privately owned. You can get a glimpse at it from the golf course off up to the upper right, but generally it's not accessible to the public anymore, except for that piece off of Old Diamond Street. All right, on to Clark's Pond, which was also sometimes called Spring Brook because that was to distinguish it from another Clark's Pond that we have in town, Clark's with an E, and that's in South Walpole. This is the Clark's Pond that's up on Stone Street, also sometimes called Spring Brook. And look at the dates for ice harvesting on Clark's Pond. Relatively late, 1899, but then the last harvest in Walpole was probably on Clark's Pond in 1944. So there's Clark's Pond as we know it today. We know it as a two-lobed pond. That Google Earth map is not doing justice to how the two lobes are actually connected. They are in fact connected. And the main big lobe that you see is what you can see if you park in the conservation area parking lot on Stone Street. And then across you see a little bridge going across, and then beyond that is the smaller lobe of Clark's Pond. But here's how it originally looked. This is 1852. That's Diamond Pond in the middle. Just upstream of Diamond Pond is a little lobe-shaped pond that is the original Clark's Pond. So it was not originally two-lobed. It was a little teardrop-shaped pond, according to that picture in 1852. And there it is again in 1888, a little sort of a bean shape or distorted bean shape pond just to the upstream of Diamond Pond, which by the way in that particular picture is not shown especially diamond-like. It's the pond right in the middle of the map. So it wasn't till Clark established a new dam to dam up Spring Brook in a different way, and also redirected Spring Brook in a way that I'm going to describe to you, that we got that new large lobe that we know as the main part of Clark's Pond today. And when I say a new dam and causeway, you're driving along the dam and causeway when you drive along Stone Street. I'll show you on the next slide. Okay, so see Stone Street, and you can see Spring Brook coming out to the upper right-hand corner, coming out of the larger lobe of Clark's Pond. And you can see maybe now that Stone Street represents a sort of a dam, because it is, that dammed up Spring Brook, and it became that large lobe, and that was in 1888. And the original Spring Brook, I've labeled this Google Earth map, is the lower right-hand corner. And here we are looking at another Google Earth version with Spring Brook going out to the right. There's 290 Stone Street, which is the location of Hub Grinding today. To the left, you can see 3 cars parked at the conservation area. And I want to show you something interesting. There's still ways to interpret this area as an old mill area. I've put 3 arrows in because there are actually used to be 3 channels going out of the large lobe of Clark's Pond. The arrow to the left is now going over toward Delcourt Drive. That was an original canal or channel going out of the pond. There was another one that went under 290 Stone Street. It no longer does, and then emerged out the back end. And then the arrow to the right is where Spring Brook actually exits. So this is based on a 1903 plan, that there used to be these 3 channels. Why 3 channels? Because when you have a mill on site, and there was a sawmill there, you control the water by having it pass through one or the other channel. So it was very common to have more than one channel exiting a pond at a mill site. And here I've actually labeled them, all right? So we have canal to the sawmill, tail race, and then notice how I put Springbrook in quotes. Remember I said that Clark redirected Springbrook? He did. So that's not even the original Springbrook. The original Springbrook came out of the smaller lobe of Clark's Pond. That was the original wasteway, what we're calling Springbrook today. All right, so around 1899, Alton Clark, who owned Clark's Pond, started the Springbrook Ice Company. And the first ice cutting was mentioned in 1901, and ever after, the newspaper wrote up Springbrook ice harvests, and there's a fairly good 20th century record of them. And little by little, over a period of a few years, the Clark family transferred the ownership of the ice harvesting company and the pond to the Allen family and the Gilmores. And again, this was a process that I think was not necessarily well documented in newspapers. It's something that I followed in the Registry of Deeds. And here is a picture of Clark's Pond showing off to the right a peninsula that gets called Crusoe Island, was called Crusoe Island, is to this day, as though you were looking across from the parking lot. Can you see that little red bridge that's in the distance there? That's dividing the large lobe of Clark's Pond from the small one. This is a 1905 postcard. Here's a familiar picture if you know Walpole history. Springbrook ice wagons that some people had ice delivered to their houses from. This was a big business in Walpole. This is probably how most people got their ice delivered from Clark's Pond. Now, we looked and looked and looked to find, not just me, but other people at the Historical Society, to find any of the cards that used to be put in people's windows to tell the iceman how much ice they needed. See that one at the top that says Springbrook is pointing to 50, so that family needed 50 pounds of ice. Turns out that Springbrook is a very common name for ice companies. So this one happens to be from New Britain, Connecticut. I was very disappointed to find out it's not from Walpole. And we have, to this day, not been able to get a hold of any of the original Springbrook ice cards from Walpole. If anyone listening to this has one at home, Walpole Historical Society would love to receive it as a donation. Here's a picture of the original ice house at Clark's Pond, and it is at the location of present-day 290 Stone Street, the location of Hub Grinding, the business that is at 290 Stone Street now. And so what is that in front of the building is present-day Stone Street, although in 1911 Stone Street did not extend all the way as far as it does now out to Washington Street. And here we see two ice houses actually. First of all, Stone Street is labeled something kind of strange there. It's labeled Charlevoix Place. That was just a colloquial, locally used name. I think it was something that was made up by either the Allens or the Gilmores. That was not an official road in Walpole at the time. But think of it as Stone Street. And then the buildings you see just to the right of Charlevoix Place, or present-day Stone Street, are a slaughterhouse and an ice house. And that's the location of 290 Stone Street to this day. And then around the other side of the pond, you can see a big ice house near Lake Avenue, if you can visualize that. And that's the ice house that probably most people who remembered it were familiar with. And there'll be more about that large Springbrook Ice Company house. By and by, they didn't have an small ice house on Stone Street. They used primarily that large one that's near Lake Avenue. Another picture, this is from another Sanborn map. At that point, there's no more ice house on Charlevoix Place, but a big Springbrook Ice Company house near that bend in the road at Lake Avenue. And here's a nice picture. We think 1920s, this is at the Walpole Historical Society, showing you the big elaborate ramp that comes up from the pond to bring the ice into the ice house. And that ice house looks in fairly good shape in the 1920s, which is why we think it was dating from then, because by the 1930s and 40s, that ice house began to look fairly decrepit. So in 1923, something happened with the Springbrook Ice Company. They began to have a contract with the Milton Ice Company to have artificial ice made for them and stored in their ice house. That was a little disappointing for me to find that out in 1923, that they were slowing down their production of pond ice and using more and more artificial ice. And again, the Turner family was coming into the picture at this pond as well. In 1936, the entire property and the two businesses associated with it, the ice business and the slaughterhouse, were auctioned off. And by 1937, the Turner family owned the entire pond and the ice business. And again, that was done quietly. And I think, again, it was done because when the Turners went and bought a pond, they were aware that they had competition and did not necessarily want to advertise that they were buying something like that. So by 1937, the Turners owned two large ponds in town, Turner's Pond or Morey's Pond and Clark's Pond. And 1940 was probably the last ice harvest there. We have some wonderful photographs of it. Two high school students at the time, Ed Bronsky and Ed Bodge, took the photos. They were probably helping out at the harvest. And here's one of their photos. By then, horses were not being used. That's a big gasoline-powered machine that is scoring the ice. And you can get a glimpse of the ramp, which is probably being powered by gasoline as well for hauling the ice up into the house. And here's a nice picture showing you the substantial ice house with the big ramp going up and people bringing the ice over to the entrance of the ramp. This is, again, is 1940. You see the house in the background there. That house is on Lake Avenue. That's the house currently where the Burtwells live, if you want to orient yourself, right at the bend in the road of Lake Avenue. And here, another picture from 1940, taken by the two high school students, showing ice being brought toward the ramp. And here's how decrepit that ice house began to look in the 1940s. In fact, it doesn't look like there's any ice stored there at all. Remember, at this point, artificial ice was the thing, and people were starting to use refrigeration, household refrigerators. So this ice house was going to suffer a fate that many, many ice houses suffered. It was going to be burned to the ground. Before I have it burned to the ground, though, let's look at this beautiful watercolor that was also done by a Walpole High School student who graduated and then went on to Boston to go to art school. And you can see a beautiful ramp going up to a very nice looking ice house. 1944, a spectacular blaze that could be seen as far away as Norwood. The old ice house went up in smoke. And an eyewitness is Katie Burtwell's mother-in-law and John Burtwell's mother, who was a young woman in that house and recalls that it was a fire that may have been started deliberately as a controlled burn and then got out of control. That seems to be her memory. So this was not an arson fire. Many, many ice house fires were. This one seems to have been an attempt by the Turner family to get rid of the old structure in 1944. And Clark's Pond turned out to be one of the first conservation properties purchased in Walpole in 1961. And Ed Bronsky, remember, he was the teenager who took some of the photographs of that last ice harvest, was one of the people that helped to organize the purchase of that pond. And notice 50% of the purchase price for which Walpole was reimbursed was $3,750 at that time. And you can still see foundations for the old ice house in the woods near Lake Avenue. And you can also see the old ice scales and foundation for a place where the ice carts and ice carts and the horses that pulled them were being housed. So if there were ever to be an archaeological dig in Walpole concerning ice houses, I would suggest that Clark's Pond might be the location. Another view of what you can see left of the foundation. And there is the ramp, or there is a foundation for the ramp at the edge of the pond that still can be seen today at Clark's Pond. All right, on to Ellis Pond, 1860s. Predates everything that I've told you so far in Walpole. And Ellis Pond is in Norwood, so that's going to require some explanation. Why am I talking about Ellis Pond in Norwood? And there it is, Ellis Pond, looking like that gray sort of shape at the top of the map. This is an 1852 map. The original boundary between Norwood and Walpole was along Hawes Brook, and Ellis Pond had one long shore in Walpole, and the original Ellis Pond ice house was therefore in Walpole when that ice harvesting business began sometime in the 1860s. By 1876, Norwood was incorporated, and there were new boundaries drawn up, and eventually Ellis Pond was completely in Norwood. So the major ice harvesting venue that occurred there technically is owned by Norwood. The Norwood Historical Society has that information. And there it is in a 1923 Sanborn map, very much in Norwood. There's Ellis Pond, and there's the Ellis Pond Ice Company, which was a very important ice company. So here's a riddle. Where is Walpole's oldest commercial ice house? On Ellis Pond in Norwood. I suggest you try it at the next Walpole Historical Society party if everyone hasn't already heard the punchline yet. A little technicality, it's no longer our oldest commercial ice house, it's Norwood's oldest commercial ice house. All right, George Plimpton's had a farm pond and an ice house at Lewis Farm. And this farm pond was not Plimpton Pond, that's on the Neponset River. This is a little pond that can no longer be seen easily. That's along East Street, across the street from the old Lewis Farm. And this was in existence as a farm pond circa 1905 to 1935. And I looked into it a little bit because there was quite a lot of talk at the Walpole Historical Society about there being an ice house there, and I wanted to find out more about it. And I think it was very much connected with the fact that Lewis had a large, very large commercial dairy. He had as many as 75 or 80 head of cattle there. And it was a special sort of dairy that was being run according to the sanitation standards that were required began to be required in the 1920s. And he needed a huge amount of ice in order to accomplish that. And I believe by the 1920s he was buying artificial ice. I don't think he was cutting ice at this little tiny pond that he had on his property, although he may have been storing ice. He did have an ice house. But I believe it was very much connected with his dairy and that he was not trying to run a commercial ice harvesting business. So here's where it is. If you can visualize this, there's East Street, there's Tanglewood Road, and there's Plimpton Street going off to the upper left. And behind a present-day house and behind some other present-day houses on Tanglewood is an elongated pond, which neighborhood kids in those days used to call the secret. So I've written that in there, the secret. You can see Lewis Farm across the street from the pond. And I believe that Lewis dug that pond to water his animals. He had large number of cattle, he also had pigs, he had sheep, he had poultry, and he did not really, until he had this pond dug, have any really convenient way to water them close to where the farm was. Did he ever cut ice on it? I think probably not. I consider it to be a farm pond. But again, he did have an ice house to support his dairy, which required quantities of ice to keep the milk cool. And here's a glimpse of that field where the pond eventually got dug, and you can see the Lewis farm across the street from it. We think this is early 20th century. Now, there is another Plimpton house. Actually, there's more than one other Plimpton house, but this particular one is called the Homestead, the Plimpton Homestead at 79 Plimpton Street. It also had a small ice house, and it also, to this day, has a small pond next to it. But I looked into this, and I'm fairly convinced that this family just had its own personal ice house and may have been cutting some ice for its own personal use. I don't think there was any sort of commercial ice harvesting going on at the homestead, just ice being cut for the use of the family. All right, we're on to Smith's Pond in South Walpole, our last pond, and it too had a relatively late start, 1895, and a relatively brief career as a ice pond in the 1920s. It was no longer used for ice. Begins with Amos Hamilton, who was a grocery store owner in South Walpole, and he had a small ice house, and he apparently hired a gang from Norwood, from a company in Norwood run by the Bushnell family, to harvest a little bit of ice on Smith's Pond for the use in his store, most likely. The Bushnells took over the ice house and took over the ice business. Remember, they're from Norwood, and they actually had quite an extensive business in Norwood. And they had their first harvest in 1899. And they also had their various problems with their ice houses burning down. They had a big fire in 1915. It was said to be set by tramps or people wandering through town, maybe sleeping there overnight. They didn't have any insurance, but according to the newspaper, the ice remained after the fire and it could be saved. This was typical, and it was also very typical for ice houses to be rebuilt extremely quickly after they were burned down. But here's what probably ended the business. In 1926, Frank Bushnell died, and apparently no one in the family took it over. And so that's why I think the last date that ice was harvested at Smith's Pond in South Walpole was sometime in the late 1920s. There's a Paul Kelly interview that you can hear or read the transcript of at the Walpole Historical Society, in which he seems to remember ice harvesting in the 1920s at that pond. Now, where is Smith's Pond? You can see it down at the bottom of that map, and you can see that it looks like most of it is in Foxborough. See the great big word Foxborough growing across the top? See Clark's Pond in South Walpole next to the post office. So in 1876, most of Smith's Pond, except for the shoreline up at the top, is in Foxborough. So this is yet another of these complicated situations where Walpole is going to claim this pond, and I'll explain why in just a minute. There again, can you see Foxborough in purple across the bottom? And you can see Clark's Pond, and you can see Ruckaduck Pond. All of those are in South Walpole, and you can barely see anything but the channels coming out of Smith's Pond. So Smith's Pond at that point is in Foxborough, but I can tell you that the ice house was in Walpole, just across the Foxborough border, just where those channels are that are coming out of the pond. That's an 1888 map. And here is something interesting that occurred in the 1930s. The Walpole-Foxborough boundary shifted. I'm going to show you more than one map of this, so this is just the beginning of me convincing you that Smith's Pond is now in Walpole. You can see a little bit of Smith's Pond there looking like it's cut in half, but the next slide shows it a little bit better. See the Walpole-Foxborough border crossing just north of Washington Street? See Smith's Pond all colored in blue there? See how the border goes straight through it? So after that 1930s border change, Smith Pond became fully half in Walpole and half in Foxborough. But I'll bet there are some people watching this saying, Smith's Pond, I've never even seen Smith's Pond. Where is Smith's Pond? And it's a very, very good question, because right now Smith's Pond is mostly heavily silted in with aquatic vegetation and is closer to looking like a wetland than an actual pond. In its day, it was truly a pond. But pollution from the stadium across the street, because we're right near Patriot Stadium right there, had a huge effect on the Neponset River, and that Smith's Pond is just downstream of the Neponset River where it crosses through the stadium. So can you see the blue arrow at the bottom? That's where three tiny, tiny figures are standing: my husband, my daughter, and me. And my daughter happens to have a commercial drone, a very good quality drone, because she's a filmmaker in New York City. And she sent that drone way up into the air, so high we could scarcely see it, just as you can scarcely see us down on the ground there. We're standing in one of the tailgating parking lots for Gillette Stadium, and we are looking at what's left of Smith's Pond. And you can see an outline of it, but you can probably see that most of the pond has aquatic vegetation and silt filling it in, and there's actually very little open water left. I've labeled Water Street there, and I've labeled the Washington Street extension up at the top. So Smith's Pond is bounded by the Washington Street extension and by Water Street in Walpole. All right, so another riddle. What pond in Foxborough may be considered to be a commercial ice pond in South Walpole? And I'm going to say that Smith's Pond is, and certainly the ice house was in South Walpole and was written up regularly in the Walpole News of the newspaper. All right, we're coming to the end of the presentation. I want to thank Roger Turner Jr. Posthumously, although I got to thank him in 2021 before he died. Thank him for putting me onto this topic and for suggesting that I pursue it. I learned about ice harvesting by doing that, and I also learned quite a bit about the history of his family in Walpole. Want to thank John Anderson, president of the Walpole Historical Society, Charles Hardy, a former high school teacher, now retired. He lived for many years in South Walpole on the property where the ice house was. There was just a foundation then. My son Sam Obar, Alice Obar, my daughter, my husband Bob Obar, the Burtwells, who really helped with some firsthand information. They live on Lake Avenue, and Carl West, who is a local historian and an expert on Clark's Pond and Diamond Pond. Now, would you like to know about any correlations between cold weather and good ice harvests? Would you like to know about any vaudeville theater people who might have been living at Clark's Pond, or an island in Morey's Pond, or more about fancy skating, which is the old-fashioned word for figure skating on Morey's Pond, and a whole lot more about the Turner family? I happen to have written a book about this, Of Wonderful Purity. It's available at the Walpole Historical Society, so it goes into actually much more depth than I just went into in this presentation on all sorts of topics, especially concerning Morey's, Diamond, Smith's, and Clark's Pond, but also some additional topics that might be of interest. And that's a picture of the beautiful ice house at Clark's Pond on the cover. The book is available at the Walpole Historical Society. We are open on Saturdays, most Saturdays, from 1 to 4 o'clock. Typically we have a flag out saying open to let you know that we are in fact open. It's run by volunteers. And come by and talk to us about any topic that you like, including ice harvesting.